It's the late 1980s in Casablanca, Morocco. I was born to a lower middle class family. Now you might think, okay, so what? Well, here's the thing. My family wasn't just any family. We had members who were part of the workers' union. So imagine the little me, probably more interested in toys and cartoons, but instead I'm hearing words like workers' strike and workers' right over dinner. But it gets more interesting. While I'm learning about strikes and rights, I'm also picking up on the leftist liberation movements that helped African countries gain independence. It's a lot for a young mind to take, right? I mean, most kids worried about homework, and here I am getting a crash course in labor relations and post-colonial politics. Now, let me tell you about my maternal grandfather. This sweet old man was something else. He lived through some serious tough times. Spanish and French occupation, no formal education, the works. But man, the stories he tell. I was his favorite grandchild. Don't tell my cousins. On the few times I've visited him, he'd share tales from his childhood. Painted a completely different picture of liberation. You know, he'd say, when we were fighting against the occupation, we were so excited. We thought once we kicked them out, everything would be perfect. But let me tell you, kid, the disappointment was real. My grandpa didn't speak English. That's just me translating what he would say. Those words stuck with me. Here was a man who lived throughout history. He had fought for his country's freedom, telling me that things didn't turn out the way they hoped. It was my first lesson in complexities of politics and the dangers of overly optimistic thinking. Aptitude, the disillusioned left from Spain to North Africa. Now, hold on. We're about to take a sharp turn. My grandfather's disillusionment wasn't unique to Morocco. In fact, it echoed a pattern that had played out decades earlier in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. You see, in the 1930s, Spain was a hotbed for leftist ideology. The left was more popular, had broader support amongst working class, and seemed poised to shape the country's future. But then came Francisco Franco and his nationalist forces. Despite the left's popularity, they failed to unite effectively against Franco. Internal divisions, ideological purity tests, and sometimes outright infighting weakened them. And you know what? Franco won, plunging Spain into decades of fascist dictatorship. This failure of the Spanish left, despite their popularity, set a pattern that would repeat itself across the world. In Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, leftist movements helped win independence, but then things took a weird turn. In places like Tunisia and Egypt, some of these leftist regimes declared war on, get this, decency and religion. Yeah, you heard that right. It was like they went from fighting for freedom to fighting against tradition and faith. Even in Morocco, government posts and big corporations were filled with folks who looked down on anyone who's speaking Darija, which is the Moroccan dialect, or Amazigh, which is the language of the indigenous people in North Africa. These lefties, as my grandpa put it, were more French than the French themselves. Imagine this, you're suspected of being religious. Forget about a promotion, buddy. It was that bad. In Tunisia, there was even a leader named Bourguiba who tried to ban hijab. Talk about overreach. Now, as a kid, I didn't fully understand all of this, but I could feel the frustration in my grandpa's voice when he talked about it. He'd say they're all crooks, referring to the politicians, and you know what? As I grew older, I started to see what he meant. The American dream and the new political landscape. Fast forward to the late 1990s, my mom and I are hopping around Morocco before finally reuniting with my dad in Ohio. Talk about a culture shock. I went from bustling the streets of Morocco to the quiet streets of Columbus. It was like stepping into a completely different world. It was a different world. We arrived right after the Clinton impeachment saga. Now picture this. I'm a kid who barely speaks English, trying to figure out why the President of the United States is in trouble. I remember asking my dad about it, but he would just shoo me away. See, he grew up in a time in Morocco where talking about politics in public could get you in serious trouble. Old habits die hard, I guess. So there I am, armed with my little limited English vocabulary, pastoring my elementary school teachers about the presidential scandals. Those poor teachers didn't know what hit them. When this curious Moroccan kid started asking about the moral compass of the nation's leader. But here's where it gets heartwarming. There was an older American lady who was friends with my mom. She had lived in Morocco for decades and visited annually. Get this, she spoke fluent Darija. Can you imagine my surprise hearing an American woman speaking my language so well? This lady, bless her heart, an interest in my curiosity about politics. She was fascinated that a kid my age was asking about presidential moral problems. She was well educated, a devout Christian, and clearly a conservative. But she never tried to push her ideology on me. Instead, she became kind of an unofficial aunt, helping out not just me, but other Moroccan kids. Looking back, I realized how lucky I was to have someone like that in my life during those early days in America. She bridged two worlds for me, Morocco and the US, in a way that made my transition a little easier. 4. 9/11 and the shift in American politics. Everything changed on September 11, 2001. I was a teenager by then, with a decent grasp of English and growing interest in following the news. But nothing could have prepared me for what came next. The rise of neocons brought a wave of discrimination that hit me and my community hard. Suddenly, some of my teachers became rude and disrespectful. I started getting suspended from middle school for the smallest things. I still remember my music teacher. I won't name her, but I remember her name. Claimed I called her a stupid bitch, which I absolutely did not. But that's not even the craziest part. Let me tell you about the substitute art teacher. He was an older guy, a veteran. One day he looked at one of my drawings, just some sticky figure, birds, house in the sun, and typical kid stuff. And you know what? He thought my little birds somehow resembled the 3 planes from 9/11. Can you believe it? He actually wrote me up for that. Thankfully, the principal later apologized to me and explained that the teacher was an older veteran and he wouldn't be coming back to the school. But man, the damage was done. It's like overnight I went from being just another kid to being viewed as a potential threat. And it wasn't just in school. One Friday night, I'm hanging out with my friends at the AMC Linux Theater, just being a normal teenager. Suddenly this Linux police officer singles me out, makes me put my hand on the wall, and searches me. His reason? Someone told him I was selling drugs. Me, a kid. Also, our local mosque was vandalized. We had stuff thrown at us. I would regularly hear terms like terrorist, towelhead, go back to your country. Some of my friends' views changed and their parents became openly racist. I mean, Columbus is considered one of the most liberal cities in the country, but let me tell you, in those days did not feel very liberal to me or my community. 5. The media circus and the Iraq War. Now, let's talk about the media during this time. You think there will be clear difference between right-wing and left-wing news, right? Wrong. As a teenager in Columbus, Ohio, I could see through the lies about the Iraq War better than most adults. Both sides of the media, left and right, became propaganda tools for the government's unjust invasion of Iraq. At the peak of the war drums, no one was allowed to talk against it. You could turn on Fox News, CNN, or MSNBC, and you would hear pretty much the same talking points. Let me give you a concrete example. In 2003, MSNBC fired their top host, Phil Donahue, for opposing the war in Iraq. A leaked memo later revealed that NBC executives considered Donahue a, quote, difficult public face for NBC in a time of war, end of quote. So much for freedom of speech and journalistic integrity, right? And it's not just Donahue. Remember Jesse Ventura, former governor of Minnesota, the guy who was a professional wrestler before he entered politics? Well, in 2003, he was hot property. MSNBC won a bidding war for his services, signing him to a lucrative 3-year contract for his own show. Sounds great, right? Well, it was great until the network learned that he was against the war in Iraq. Suddenly, Ventura's show disappeared faster than you could say weapons of mass destruction. The kicker, they paid him for 3 years to do nothing. Watching all of this unfold, I couldn't help but remember what my grandfather told me back in Morocco in his plain, simple words. They're all the same, end of quote. And you know what? He was right. While the Republicans are open about their bigotry and bloodthirst, Democrats, with very few exceptions, were just as hawkish. They could be as racist as long as they were eloquent. 6. finding my political home in a sea of disillusionment. So where does a politically aware teenager turn when both sides seem equally problematic? For me, it was a mix of libertarianism and some neoliberal ideas. I know. It sounds like a strange cocktail, but hear me out. From the libertarian side, I was drawn to the anti-war voices. They seemed to be the only ones constantly speaking out against the warmongering that had taken over both major parties. But I couldn't fully embrace the libertarianism because I also believed in things they typically opposed. You see, I also held some neoliberal views. I believed in antitrust legislation to break up monopolies and trusts, labor reform to protect workers' rights, improve working conditions, social welfare programs to address poverty and inequality, universal healthcare, and tuition-free colleges. So yeah, I was a bit of a political ad duck. Some might call it the libertarian left, but really, I was just trying to make sense of a complex world and find a political ideology that aligned with my experiences and values. 7. The Arab Spring and the echoes of Spain. 2008 rolls around, and despite a nagging voice in my head warning me that he might not be different from Bush, I got caught up in Obama's Hope and Change campaign. I mean, can you blame me? After the Bush years, the idea of hope and change was intoxicating. But reality has a way of sobering you up quickly. Obama continued many of Bush's policies and wars. He cracked down on whistleblowers harder than any other president before him. It was a harsh lesson in the difference between campaign promises and political realities. Then came the Arab Spring. Suddenly, the region of North Africa and the Middle East, young people were taken to the streets demanding democracy and change. It was exciting, it was hopeful, but it was also incredibly complex. I found myself glued to the news, reading everything I could get my hands on. You see, I've always been fascinated by the politics of the Middle East, North Africa, South America, parts of Asia. It's not just my heritage, it's the region that reflects many of the same problems and issues in the world. It's complex history that takes decades to really grasp. As I watched events unfold, I couldn't help but draw parallels to what I've learned about the Spanish Civil War. In Egypt, voices like Bassem Youssef, Mohammed al-Baradei, or Bassem Youssef, think of him as like the Egyptian Jon Stewart, became symbols of the revolution. Liberal voices were preaching about human rights, freedom of speech, workers' rights, equal distribution of wealth, fair elections. It all sounded great, but here's where it gets messy. In Egypt's first fair democratic elections ever, Mohammed Morsi from the Muslim Brotherhood won. Now, the Brotherhood had its issues, but they also had credibility. They ran NGOs, helped the poor, and many of their members had been political prisoners. People liked them, but it didn't last. After just a year filled with obstacles, the Egyptian military took back the power in a bloody coup. And you know what's really disappointing? The majority of those liberal voices who had been calling for fair elections, democratic values, they had no problems when the military thugs burned people alive in the streets of Cairo. It was like watching the replay of Spain in the 1930s. The left, despite the popularity and promises, failed to unite and stand firm against the authoritarian forces. The result, another victory for oppression and another defeat for democracy, if you want to call it that. 8. The global political circus, from the Arab Spring to the American Autumn. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's the Middle East or Asia. Surely things are different in America, right? Well, let me tell you, the disappointment I witnessed during the Arab Spring had some eerily familiar echoes in American politics. Remember how I talked about the Egyptian liberals who quickly abandoned their principles when the military took power? I started noticing similar patterns in American politics, especially with the Democratic Party. Let's take a step back. In 2009, right after Obama's historic election, there was Joe Lieberman, a former Democratic vice presidential nominee who single-handedly killed the public option in Obamacare. This was a provision that could have made healthcare much cheaper for Americans. Sounds familiar? It's the same pattern of talking big about change, then backpedaling when it's time to deliver. And fast forward to today, we've got figures like Joe Manchin and Sinema. They position themselves as moderate Democrats, but constantly block legislation. It's like watching a rerun of the same show, just with different actors. Now, why does this happen? Well, just like Egypt or Morocco or Tunisia, just follow the money. These politicians rake in millions from lobbyists and industries like fossil fuels, pharmaceutical, and insurance. Manchin, for example, has received huge sums from the oil and gas industry. It reminds me of those liberal voices in Egypt who quickly aligned with the military when power shifted. In America, we don't have the military take power, but we do have the revolving door, that cushy retirement gig politicians get after they leave office, becoming highly paid lobbyists for the very industries they were supposed to regulate. This whole dance, it's not so different from what I saw in Africa or the Middle East. The Democratic Party in the US seems to have perfected a strategy that eerily similar to what I observed in supposedly secular regimes back home. They need to look like they care about the working class or minorities or the environment without actually rocking the corporate boat. During campaigns, they make big promises and get everyone fired up. It's like the early days of the Arab Spring all over again. Hope, change, revolution. But once they win, it's back to business as usual. They've got it down to a science, blaming few bad apples like Manchin for blocking progress, all while keeping their corporate donors happy. It's a delicate balancing act. They need to keep enough seats to maintain power, but not so many that they actually have to deliver on their promises. It's like watching a high wire act, where the acrobat is trying to please two audiences on opposite sides of the wire. This pattern of revolution promised but never delivered, of liberals who quickly abandon their principles when it's convenient. It's not unique to any one country or region, whether it's Spain in the 1930s, Egypt during the Arab Spring, or the United States today. The political circus seems to follow a similar script. In conclusion, so what's the takeaway from this wildlife and personal and political journey? Maybe it's that race, money is simple, left, right, middle. These labels often fall short when the rubber meets the road. My story is taken to Casablanca to the suburbs of This is everyone, as usual, comment, like, and subscribe, share this podcast, and tell me what you think. Again, this was your boy Nabil, and peace out.